Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chelsea, and today I'm going to be doing a slightly different version of my recommendations videos. Normally I follow the Goodreads group monthly recommendations, and I follow their theme and recommend books based on their theme. This month I'm going to kind of mix it up. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I wanted to do a video about books about all the varying types of mental illness that I have read and have really stuck with me. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into the whole slew of books that I have picked out for you guys. Now, the very first book that I thought of for this tag is the first book that I ever personally read that really dealt with real issues, like real mental illness, and it's stuck with me ever since. And that book is Impulse by Ellen Hopkins. This is actually the very first Ellen Hopkins books that I ever read. It was the first experience with books in verse. This book is told from three different teens' perspectives, all of which who have attempted suicide and obviously failed and have gotten themselves put into a summer camp to basically rehabilitate them and work on their mental health. This book is the very first book that I read that is extremely raw, it's very real, and it's rough. It's a heavy, heavy read, and it's not enjoyable, but I feel like it's very important. Ellen Hopkins also came out with a sequel to it called Perfect, and this follows what happens after Impulse went down, and I just think that these two books are very important to read about suicide and depression and how it can affect different people differently and what leads people to that point and how they get to that point and how they can proceed beyond that. In a very, very similar vein, I'm going to recommend a book that I read years ago, back when I was running a blog, and it was sent to me for review, but it's kind of a very similar vibe and feel to Impulse, and that is Freeze Tag on the Highway, and this is by Brian Kranz. It's a very similar situation. It's a summer camp for kids who have mental illnesses, who are trying to overcome it and learn how to lead a normal life and socialize and everything. And again, this book is also very real, very raw, and I'm going to highly recommend it. Sticking in the same vein as far as depression and suicide goes, I'm going to recommend The Burn Journals, and this is by Brent Runyon. I read this for a book group, I want to say, back when I was a teenager, and this is about a boy who attempted to commit suicide by lighting himself on fire, did not succeed, and is his story while he is in the hospital in rehab and getting skin grafts done, and trying to cope with the fact that he failed at the one thing that he thought would release him. And it's not as heavy as some of the other books mentioned, but it's definitely a very eye-opening experience and very raw as far as the aftermath of a suicide attempt, on how it can affect you, it can affect your whole family, it can affect everybody in your life. It was a very eye-opening read for me. And the last book that I want to recommend as far as depression and suicidal thoughts go is It's Kind of a Funny Story by Ned Vizzini. This is also one of those books that has stuck with me for years. This was nothing like I expected it to be and everything that I wanted it to be. This is about a boy who checked himself into a mental rehab facility and is going through the process of meeting other mental patients in the psych ward and learning how to cope with his tics and his mental cycles that he goes through. The characters in this are so heartwarming. It's a very real story. It's very blunt, but at the same time, it's a very beautiful story. The writing in it is beautiful, and it's a very hopeful type story, whereas some of the other books mentioned are very dark and sometimes too real. This one is a very refreshing story, and I really highly recommend this one. Getting into a different type of mental illness, I want to talk about OCD and the books that I have read that have kind of dealt with that. The first one being Say What You Will by Cami McGovern. I personally did not like this book, but I think that it handled the mental illness very, very realistically and very well. I personally did not grow too attached to the characters, which was my main issue. I think some of the situations were unrealistic, but how she deals with the physical and the mental illness that happens in this book is very well done. It's very real, and it's not sugar-coated. It's not flowery as far as how trying OCD is. As far as plot goes, I didn't think that it held its weight as far as realness. I'm just gonna say the word real a lot in this video because we're talking real talk right now. But I am going to recommend this as far as realistic approaches to OCD. I'm also going to recommend The Rest of Us Just Live Here. If you're looking for a lighter story that is not wholly revolving around mental illness, this is the book for you. It's a very entertaining story about a town of regular people who live in the world of superheroes and epic stories of all of the crazy heroes that happen in YA stories. This is about everybody else who lives in the town. But I just really liked that the characters in this were very real teenagers. They had issues, they had drama, but it was never anything super significant. But it handled things very well. One of the main characters has OCD, and it's just kind of his dealings with it and how his friends have learned to cope with him and help him through it. So this is a much lighter version of any of the books I'm going to recommend, and I just like this book in general. Also, on a somewhat lighter note, I'm going to recommend Mosquito Land by David Arnold. This kind of deals with manic depression. I did not expect the mental illness twist that this book took. It's a very YA contemporary type book. It's about a road trip. It's about a girl who hops on a Greyhound bus because she thinks something is going on with her mom that she isn't quite sure about, and travels across the country to get to her. And it's about her journey and meeting all of these crazy characters along the way. And it's a really, really entertaining ride of a book. But when this book gets down to its roots, it's very real. It's very heavy. It deals with stuff that you don't expect to hit you the way it hits you. It definitely deals with some sort of mental illness with the main character, with what she thinks she is dealing with in her own head, and then it deals with what her mom is also dealing with, and I love this book. This is one of the few 5-star books that I read last year, and I'm always going to recommend this to people. It's a really good summer read because it's not very heavy. Getting into the topic of anxiety, which is something that I personally deal with, so I always kind of am drawn towards books that deal with characters who have varying levels of anxiety. And of course, the first book that I have to mention is Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson. This is about a girl where something happened to her at a party that has made her an outcast and shamed and bullied in school, and she has chosen to be mute. She is not going to talk to anybody, will not talk, and it's about learning how to overcome this anxiety and learning how to find your voice as a teenager and as a female and as a person in society in general. I'm pretty sure everyone has read this book. It was required reading in my 7th grade class, I want to say. It's just a phenomenal story. I highly recommend this book. And staying in the trend of anxiety and also kind of everything in general that could be thrown in there, a much lighter story is going to be Let's Pretend This Never Happened by Jenny Lawson. This is a nonfiction story, so this is going to be real talk, people. I read this, and I'm going to recommend this, and I'm going to recommend Furiously Happy, her second book. She pretty much breaks down her childhood and her life, and it's a memoir as far as really funny childhood stories and also really dark stories of what it's actually like living with OCD and depression and kind of manic tendencies. She kind of has a whole cocktail of mental illness that she deals with, but she deals with it in a very humorous way, but it's extremely, extremely relatable, and I'm going to highly recommend this book and Furiously Happy as a book for anybody to really check out if you're looking to delve into nonfiction or memoirs, but you're kind of intimidated. These will make you die laughing, but it will also hit you really, really hard with the real mental illness stuff. So definitely these books. The next book I want to recommend, as far as anxiety goes, is Finding Audrey, and this book took me by surprise. Based on the fact that it's by Sophie Kinsella, who wrote the Shopaholic books, they were books that I never planned on reading. They're extremely fluffy contemporary chick lit books. This book is not that. Even though it kind of looks that way, it definitely deals with anxiety. It deals with a girl who has agoraphobia. Something happened to her that you never find out about, that has caused her to be terrified of leaving her house. And it's basically her trying to learn how to come out of her shell and how to be more comfortable in the world. And it was handled very briefly, but very well. I liked that it did not sugarcoat anything. It didn't glaze over anything that needed to be glazed over. This is just a gem of a book that I feel like a lot of people missed, and I think a lot of people would get so much out of this book because it was very easy to read, but it definitely got the point across. One book that may not be mentioned that much as far as mental illness goes, but I think is kind of important to be talked about, is Every Day by David Levithan. This is a book that is not necessarily a mental illness book, but it just kind of opens your eyes up to the mental capacity of multiple people. This is about a boy who, or not necessarily a boy, we don't know what he is. This is about a person who wakes up in a different body every single day. So he is in their head, he has his own mind, but he has to deal with how people think and how people live. And it's very refreshing to see every single chapter being a completely different person in a completely different life with different issues, as far as emotional issues, mental issues, physical issues. It was just so eye-opening to see so many different people, and a couple of them touch on mental illness, but it was just very interesting to see all the different minds that you can read through in YA. It was just such an interesting experience for me. And I'm going to finish this video out with one of what I think is hands down the best mental illness book that I have ever read, and I'm going to always recommend it to people, and that is Challenger Deep by Neal Shusterman. This is a book that is based off of Neal Shusterman's own son and pretty much his dive into insanity. It talks about schizophrenia and manic depressive issues and anxiety and OCD issues, but it is the realist representation of what it's like to basically go crazy. And it's terrifying to read, and it's hard to read, but it's very important to read. Each chapter jumps between what is happening in the real world versus what's happening in his head, and there's also this whole fantastical world that he has playing in his head that kind of parallels what is actually happening in his real life. It was just so gripping to read this story. I have an entire video about this book. I will leave the review linked down below. The metaphors and the symbols in this book are just so spot on as far as the concept of literally diving into your mind and how it can slip away from you so quickly. So I am going to recommend this book like 10 times over to anybody. That's gonna be it for this video. I know that was a whole bunch of books that I threw at you. I hope you guys took something out of this. If you have books that you would like to recommend to me, I am kind of always looking for books. For some reason, mental illness is kind of one of my like go-to themes in books. So I think it's a topic that is starting to be explored a lot more, and I think that it's very important for a lot of people to read all different perspectives of it and to see all different perspectives of what other people are dealing with inside of their own heads. It's something that you can't see what's wrong with them, and it can be so much harder, I think, than a lot of physical issues that people have, just because you can't explain what's going on inside of your head. So I just think reading about it is always very eye-opening and very important to people. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys are reading some amazing books, and I will see you guys next time.